the public relations firm of Shirley and Banister. And ResistNet.com is a hub for online organizing for anti-health reform protests. You can find there, among other things, a video entitled "Obama Equals Hitler."
A Nazi rally.
For 35 years, I've worked in every major media market in the United States, and I've written for more than 100 newspapers and magazines nationally and internationally. So last September 17th, I became the first journalist in U.S. history to go to the U.S. National Archives and the Library of Congress and pore over the thousands of pages of documents in both places to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt or any refutation of the facts that Prescott Bush, the grandfather of George W. Bush, and George Herbert Walker, his maternal great-grandfather for whom his daddy is named, were Nazi traitors to the country who should have been tried for treason. 2 weeks ago, in early August, a major world newspaper, The Guardian of London, finally got on the story internationally, and they flew a renowned reporter of theirs named Duncan Campbell over to Washington to take me back to the archives and Library of Congress so that they could verify that these explosive documents were real and I didn't have forged copies. Prescott Bush was the grandfather of George W. Bush and the father of George Herbert Walker Bush, and George Herbert Walker Bush is named for his father-in-law, George Herbert Walker. Prescott Bush graduated from Yale in 1917 and was in Skull and Bones with E. Roland Harriman, who was the younger brother of W. Averill Harriman. The Bush family really had nothing going. They were essentially social climbers and opportunistic people. At the time that Prescott Bush met Dorothy Walker, he was a tire salesman. 8 months after the U.S. had entered the war, the New York Herald Tribune ran a front-page article, "Hitler's Angel has $3 million in U.S. bank." And it caused a major scandal and just rocked the world of politics. Brown Brothers Harriman, which George Herbert Walker and Prescott Bush were affiliated with and partners in, worked with I.G. Farben, which operated Auschwitz. In actuality, it was anything but a bank. It was essentially a Nazi money laundering operation that had a lot of tentacles into a lot of different other businesses. They owned a shipping line called Hamburg American Line, for example, which was the first Nazi front business seized, although the line was no longer operational in 1942. In the early 1930s, it transported Nazi spies into the U.S., and then their promotional ads offered cash rewards to any American citizens who would go back on Hamburg American Lines and proselytize for Hitler. In some very shocking documents that I saw at the Library of Congress 2 weeks ago on August 10th, on August 9th, excuse me, had to do with the hearings of the McCormick-Dickstein Committee of November 1934, show that Prescott Bush and the DuPont family, the Remington family, and J.P. Morgan tried to overthrow the U.S. government, assassinate FDR, and put a Hitler-style fascist state in place. I have in my possession testimony from the McCormick-Dickstein Committee in November of 1934 by one of the fascist plotters that they were going to follow Hitler's model exactly and impose martial law on the United States. And he did all that he could to proselytize for Hitler and the rise of his Third Reich. Incredibly, after being warned by the FBI and the Justice Department and the Treasury Department to cease and desist in their Nazi dealings, they had continued them until 1951. There had been 28 additional seizures of Nazi assets and Nazi business fronts between late 1942 and 1951, and that they had moved Nazi assets into Switzerland, Brazil, Argentina, and Panama, and they had continued to do business with their primary Nazi patron, who was Fritz Thyssen, who backed Hitler beginning in 1921 and who was the wealthiest man in Germany, and a steel and coal baron who, with his partner Friedrich Flick, essentially built the Nazi war machine along with I.G. Farben. And take his philosophical foundation from the Bible or the teachings of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. George Bush takes his inspiration from what he learned in Skull and Bones and from the Thule Society that Hitler and Goebbels and Goring cut their teeth in. Organizations that perpetrate the ugly things that these criminals are doing to this country for which they must be held accountable. Now you look at the Republican National Convention this week and you bring in Arnold Schwarzenegger to speak last night. Schwarzenegger is the son of a Nazi. He has praised Nazis. He has praised Hitler. He talked last night in terms like, we will not falter, we will not waver, we will win this war on terror.
He is a leader who doesn't flinch, who doesn't waver, and does not back down.
Well, that's exactly the speeches that Hitler made after the Reichstag fire. Terrorism and the homeland being under attack are precisely the issues that Hitler used to subvert everything within the German system of government. This is a criminal regime. They not only emulate Hitler, but its genesis comes from Hitler. And I defy anyone, a historian, journalist, author, anyone, to come forward and disprove my premise that you cannot differentiate Hitler's invasion of Poland in 1939 and the Reichstag fire and his attempt to dominate the world from George W. Bush's unprovoked invasion of Iraq and subversion of the Constitution through the Patriot Act after 9/11, which I submit is his Reichstag fire. Karl Rove and his minions are every bit the masters of propaganda that Joseph Goebbels was. They literally took lessons from Goebbels and Goring about how to create such brilliant propaganda. There's just an endless broken record that is leading up to the present era, that the Bush family has had a single goal for 100 years, which is to become the most powerful family on the planet and to rule the world. It's critical that every citizen of this country rise up and do something, because the day of reckoning is at hand, and these people are Nazis. They are practicing Nazi philosophy. They are mimicking Nazi tactics. This is a criminal regime. They not only emulate Hitler, but its genesis comes from Hitler. And I defy anyone, a historian, journalist, author, anyone, to come forward and disprove my premise that you cannot differentiate Hitler's invasion of Poland in 1939 and the Reichstag fire and his attempt to dominate the world from George W. Bush's unprovoked invasion of Iraq and subversion of the Constitution through the Patriot Act after 9/11.
Commissions Act of 2006 and what it does to something called habeas corpus. Congress passed the Military Commissions Act to give Mr. Bush the power to deal effectively with America's enemies, those who seek to harm the country. He has been very clear about who he thinks that is.
The very word secrecy is repugnant
and for a newspaper
in a free
to publish
and open
does
society.
great harm to the United States
And we
of
are,
America.
as a people,
the fact that we're discussing
inherently
this program
and historically opposed to
helping
secret
the enemy.
societies, to
So the
secret
President
oaths,
said it was
and
urgent
to
that
secret
Congress send
proceedings.
him this bill as quickly as possible.
We decided
not for
long
the
ago
politics of next month's elections,
that the
but for
dangers of
America.
excessive and unwarranted concealment
The need for this
of
legislation is
pertinent
urgent.
facts far outweighed the
We need to
dangers
ensure that those
which are
questioned
cited to
terrorists
justify it.
can continue to do everything
Even today,
within the limits of the law.
there is little value in
to get
opposing the
information
threat of a closed
that can save
society
American lives.
by imitating its arbitrary
My
restrictions.
administration will continue to work with
Even
the Congress
today, there
to
is
get
little
this
value
legislation
in
enacted.
ensuring the survival
The
of our
time is
nation.
of the essence.
if our traditions do not survive
Congress
with
is in
it.
session just for a few more weeks.
And there is very grave
Passing this
danger
legislation ought to be the
that an
top
announced
priority.
need for
Families
increased
of those murdered that
security
day have waited
will be
patiently
seized
for
upon by
justice.
those anxious to expand its meaning
Some of the families are with us
to
today.
the very limits of
They
official
should have to wait
censorship
no longer.
and concealment.
Ratification request for extradition treaties with Malta,
For we are
Estonia, and
opposed
Latvia,
around the world
with proclamation of
by a
German-American
monolithic
Day, the
and
Partners
ruthless
for Fish and
conspiracy.
Wildlife.
Well, when the president does it, that means that it is not illegal.
Was the exposure of the beginnings of a national security state which believes it has the right to override the Constitution.